Many years ago, along the quiet, rocky coast of Maine, stood a tall white lighthouse overlooking the endless Atlantic Ocean. The lighthouse had been there for more than 100 years. Its bright light had guided thousands of ships safely through fog, rain, snow, and dark nights. The man who cared for the lighthouse was named Thomas Walker. Thomas was 68 years old. He had lived beside the lighthouse for almost 40 years. Every morning he woke up before sunrise. The sound of gentle waves rolling against the rocks served as his natural alarm clock. He stretched slowly, opened the small wooden window of his cozy bedroom, and breathed in the cool, salty air. The ocean looked peaceful. Small fishing boats rested quietly in the harbor. White seagulls floated above the water. The sky slowly changed from deep blue to soft pink as the first sunlight appeared on the horizon. Thomas smiled. He loved mornings more than anything else. He walked downstairs and placed an old kettle on the stove. Soon, the smell of fresh coffee filled the little lighthouse kitchen. He toasted 2 slices of bread, spread butter on them, and enjoyed a simple breakfast while looking out at the sea. There was never any hurry. Life at the lighthouse followed the slow rhythm of nature. After breakfast, Thomas carried a broom and began sweeping the lighthouse. He cleaned every step of the long spiral staircase. He polished the brass railings until they shined like gold. Then he climbed all the way to the lantern room at the very top. The giant glass windows were spotless. The powerful lamp was clean and ready for another night. Thomas carefully checked every part of the mechanism. Everything worked perfectly. Outside, the wind blew gently across the cliffs. Wildflowers moved softly in the breeze. The ocean sparkled under the warm morning sun. It was going to be another peaceful day in Maine. Once again, he had nowhere else he wanted to be. For him, the lighthouse was more than a workplace. It was home. And as another quiet day began beside the endless sea, Thomas knew that when evening arrived, the light would once again shine across the dark ocean, helping strangers safely find their way home. The morning passed slowly and peacefully. After finishing his work in the lantern room, Thomas walked down the winding staircase, one careful step at a time. Outside, the air was cool and fresh. The ocean stretched endlessly before him, sparkling beneath the gentle sunlight. He followed a narrow path that led to the rocky shore. Tiny waves rolled in and quietly disappeared against the smooth stones. Thomas enjoyed listening to the sea. Each wave sounded a little different. Some whispered softly. Some sighed gently. Others made a calm, rhythmic splash that seemed almost like a lullaby. He sat on an old wooden bench facing the water. A family of seagulls circled high above the lighthouse before gliding toward the beach. Far away, a fishing boat moved slowly across the calm Atlantic. Its engine was so distant that it sounded like a quiet hum carried by the wind. Thomas tipped his hat to the fishermen, even though they were too far away to see him. It had become his little morning tradition. After a while, he returned to the small garden beside the lighthouse. The garden was simple but beautiful. There were blue hydrangeas, white daisies, lavender, and a few bright yellow wildflowers. Thomas filled a watering can and slowly watered each plant. The scent of lavender mixed with the salty ocean breeze. It was one of his favorite smells. A small orange cat wandered into the garden. The cat visited almost every afternoon. Thomas smiled and placed a tiny bowl of fresh water near the flowers. The cat rubbed against his boots before curling up in a warm patch of sunshine. Neither of them made a sound. They simply enjoyed the peaceful afternoon together. Clouds drifted lazily across the bright blue sky. The lighthouse stood tall behind them, watching over the coastline just as it had done for generations. As the day slowly moved toward evening, Thomas looked out across the sea once again. Soon it would be time to climb the spiral staircase, light the great beacon, and send its warm, steady light across the dark ocean. For now, though, there was nothing to do except enjoy the quiet, breathed the fresh sea air, and listened to the endless song of the waves. The afternoon slowly faded into evening. The golden sunlight stretched across the ocean, turning the gentle waves into ribbons of shimmering light. Thomas looked at the old clock hanging on the kitchen wall. It was almost time. He picked up his lantern and quietly stepped outside. The cool evening breeze carried the fresh scent of salt water and pine trees. The sky glowed with soft shades of orange, pink, and lavender. One by one, the fishing boats returned to the harbor. Their captains waved toward the lighthouse. Thomas raised his hand and smiled. He had greeted the fishermen this way for many years. Soon, the harbor became quiet again. Only the gentle sound of water touching the wooden docks remained. Thomas opened the heavy lighthouse door and began climbing the long spiral staircase. Each step echoed softly inside the tower. He knew every stair by heart. When he reached the lantern room, he carefully checked the great Fresnel lens. It was perfectly clean. The polished glass reflected the last rays of the setting sun. Thomas switched on the great beacon. At first, a warm glow filled the room. Then the bright light slowly began its steady circle across the darkening sea. Round and round it turned, never rushing, never stopping. Far beyond the rocky coast, a cargo ship appeared on the horizon. Its captain saw the familiar beam and adjusted the ship's course. The lighthouse quietly did its work, just as it had every night for generations. Outside, the first stars appeared in the clear Maine sky. The moon rose slowly above the ocean, painting a silver path across the calm water. Thomas stood beside the window for a few peaceful moments. He watched the waves, listened to the wind, and felt thankful for another quiet evening. There were no loud noises, no busy streets, only the steady turning light, the endless sea, and the peaceful rhythm of the night. For Thomas, that was more than enough. As darkness settled over the coast, the lighthouse continued to shine, calm, steady, and welcoming, guiding every traveler safely through the night. The night grew deeper. The lighthouse beam continued its slow, steady journey across the Atlantic Ocean. Every few seconds, its warm light swept over the dark water, then moved on again. Thomas sat in a wooden chair beside the large window of the lantern room. An old notebook rested on the small table next to him. Every evening, he wrote a few simple notes. The sky is clear. The sea is calm. The wind is gentle from the northeast. He had filled dozens of notebooks over the years. Together, they told the quiet story of the sea. Outside, the waves rolled softly against the rocks below. Their gentle rhythm never seemed to end. Sometimes the water whispered. Sometimes it hummed. Sometimes it became so quiet that Thomas could hear only the breeze passing around the lighthouse tower. A pair of owls flew silently across the cliffs. Somewhere in the distance, a lonely buoy bell rang. Then, silence. Several minutes later, clang. The sound drifted gently across the water. Thomas smiled. He had listened to that bell for so many years that it felt like an old friend. Around midnight, he stepped onto the narrow balcony that circled the top of the lighthouse. The cool air felt fresh against his face. Above him, thousands of stars sparkled in the clear Maine sky. The Milky Way stretched like a river of light from one horizon to the other. Thomas quietly looked upward. Every night, the stars reminded him how vast and peaceful the world could be. Far below, the ocean reflected the moonlight. The waves shimmered like tiny pieces of silver. Nothing hurried, nothing demanded attention. The lighthouse stood firm on the rocky shore, just as it always had. Its light continued to turn, slowly, patiently, faithfully. Thomas took one last deep breath of the cool sea air before returning inside. The beacon shone brightly. The clock ticked softly. The waves kept their gentle rhythm. And through the peaceful Maine night, the old lighthouse watched over every sailor who passed, offering a quiet promise that morning would come again. The lighthouse remained awake while the rest of the coast slept peacefully. Its bright beam continued to turn, reaching far across the quiet Atlantic Ocean. Inside the lantern room, Thomas poured himself a cup of warm chamomile tea. The steam rose gently into the cool night air. He wrapped both hands around the mug and stood beside the window. The warmth felt comforting. Outside, the moon had climbed high into the sky. Its soft silver light rested on the calm sea. The waves looked like smooth sheets of glass, moving slowly toward the shore. From time to time, a gentle breeze brushed against the lighthouse. The old tower answered with a quiet creak. Thomas had heard that sound for many years. To him, it was not strange. It was simply the lighthouse saying, "Good evening." He smiled and listened. Far below, the little orange cat from the garden had found a dry place beneath the porch. It curled into a small ball and fell asleep, safe from the cool night wind. A few stars reflected in tiny pools of seawater left behind by the evening tide. They sparkled like little diamonds among the smooth stones. Thomas opened his weather journal once again. He carefully wrote the time. He noted the gentle wind. He recorded the calm sea. His handwriting was slow and neat, just as it had always been. When he finished, he closed the notebook and placed it back on the shelf, beside dozens of others. Each journal held memories of quiet nights, peaceful mornings, and countless sunsets. None of them told exciting adventures. Instead, they told the story of ordinary days lived with care and kindness. Thomas believed that ordinary days were often the most beautiful. As the hours passed, the eastern horizon slowly began to change. The black sky softened into deep navy blue. A faint ribbon of pale light appeared far away. Morning was coming. Thomas smiled quietly. Another peaceful night had passed. The lighthouse had guided every ship safely through the darkness. Soon, fishermen would leave the harbor once again. Seagulls would return to the sky. The waves would continue their endless song, and Thomas would begin another simple, gentle day beside the sea, grateful for the quiet life he called home. The first light of dawn slowly spread across the horizon. The stars faded one by one, and the moon quietly slipped behind a thin layer of morning clouds. The lighthouse beacon completed its final slow turn before Thomas gently switched it off. The lantern room became peaceful and still. For a moment, only the sound of the waves could be heard. Thomas opened one of the tall windows. Fresh ocean air filled the room. It carried the scent of salt, pine trees, and the cool morning mist. He took a deep breath and smiled. Every sunrise felt like a new beginning. Far below, the sea was waking up. A few fishing boats left the harbor, moving slowly across the calm water. Their engines hummed softly in the distance. The captains gave a friendly wave toward the lighthouse. Thomas raised his hand in return. It was a quiet tradition that had lasted for many years. He carefully walked down the spiral staircase, one step at a time. The old wooden stairs creaked gently beneath his boots. At the bottom, he opened the lighthouse door. The grass was covered with tiny drops of dew that sparkled in the morning sunlight. The little orange cat stretched, yawned, and greeted Thomas with a gentle purr. Thomas filled a small bowl with fresh water and placed a little food beside it. The cat ate happily, while Thomas watered the flowers in the garden. The lavender swayed gently in the breeze. White daisies turned their faces toward the rising sun. Bees buzzed quietly from flower to flower. Everything felt calm. Everything felt unhurried. Thomas picked up his old wooden chair and carried it to the edge of the cliff. He sat down with a warm cup of coffee and watched the endless Atlantic Ocean. There was nothing he needed to rush toward, nothing he wished away. The peaceful morning was enough. As the golden sunlight spread across the sea, the lighthouse stood proudly behind him, waiting patiently for another evening when its faithful light would once again guide travelers safely through the darkness. The morning slowly turned into a gentle afternoon. The sun climbed higher into the clear blue sky, filling the rocky coastline with warm golden light. Thomas spent the next few hours doing the small jobs that kept the lighthouse in good condition. He inspected the wooden fence around the garden. A few boards had become loose after the winter storms. With a hammer and a handful of nails, he carefully repaired each one. There was no hurry. He enjoyed working slowly. When he finished, he stepped back and admired his work. The fence looked strong again. A gentle breeze carried the scent of the ocean across the cliffs. Wildflowers swayed softly beside the narrow walking path. Butterflies drifted from blossom to blossom, moving as gently as floating leaves. Thomas sat beneath a small pine tree and opened a well-loved book. It was an old collection of stories about sailors, quiet harbors, and distant shores. He had read the book many times before. Still, every page felt comforting, like meeting an old friend. From time to time, he looked up from the book and watched the sea. A sailboat moved slowly across the sparkling water. Its white sail caught the afternoon sunlight, glowing brightly against the deep blue ocean. Thomas smiled. There was something peaceful about watching a boat travel without rushing. Nearby, the little orange cat slept in the shade of the flowers. A bumblebee buzzed lazily past without disturbing it. Everything around the lighthouse seemed to move at its own calm pace. As the afternoon grew quieter, soft clouds drifted across the sky. Their shadows glided gently over the sea, changing the color of the water from bright blue to deep green and back again. Thomas closed his book and listened. The waves, the wind, the distant call of a seagull, these simple sounds had been the music of his life for many years. Would not have traded them for anything. Soon, the sun would begin its slow journey toward the horizon. Another peaceful evening was waiting, and when the sky filled with soft shades of orange and purple, Thomas would once again climb the spiral staircase and light the great beacon, sending its warm glow across the quiet waters of Maine. As the afternoon slowly faded, the sunlight became softer and warmer. Long golden rays stretched across the cliffs, touching the wildflowers, the old lighthouse, and the quiet sea. Thomas looked toward the western horizon. The sun was beginning its slow descent. He picked up a small wicker basket and walked down the narrow path to the little village nearby. The villagers knew him well. Everyone greeted him with a friendly smile. "Good evening, Thomas," the baker said as he handed over a fresh loaf of warm bread. Thomas thanked him kindly. Next he visited the tiny market and bought a bottle of fresh milk, a few apples, and a piece of local cheese. There was no rush. The village was as peaceful as the lighthouse. Children laughed softly as they played in the village square. An elderly couple sat together on a wooden bench, watching the evening sky. A gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of freshly baked bread through the quiet streets. Thomas wished everyone a pleasant evening before beginning the short walk back to the lighthouse. When he reached the top of the cliff, he paused for a moment. The view was breathtaking. The Atlantic Ocean shimmered beneath the setting sun. The sky glowed with shades of orange, pink, and lavender. The lighthouse cast a long shadow across the grass. Back inside, Thomas prepared a simple supper. He sliced the fresh bread, added cheese and apple slices to a small wooden plate, and poured himself a cup of warm tea. He ate slowly while watching the sea through the kitchen window. The little orange cat sat quietly beside the door, hoping for a tiny piece of cheese. Thomas smiled and shared a small bite. As the last light of day faded, he washed his plate, put on his warm blue jacket, and picked up the heavy brass key to the lantern room. It was almost time once again. The lighthouse had rested all day. Soon, its great light would awaken and begin its steady journey across the darkening sea. Thomas placed one hand on the smooth wooden railing and started climbing the spiral staircase. One step, then another, just as he had done every evening for nearly 40 years. Outside, the first evening star appeared above the peaceful coast of Maine, quietly welcoming another calm and beautiful night. Thomas reached the top of the lighthouse, just as the last golden light of the sun disappeared beyond the horizon. For a few quiet moments, he stood beside the great glass windows and watched the evening sky. The colors changed slowly. Orange faded into pink, pink faded into purple. Then the sky became a deep, peaceful blue. One by one the first stars appeared. Thomas carefully inspected the great Fresnel lens. Every piece of glass was perfectly clean. He gently polished one small corner with a soft cloth, then checked the clockwork mechanism that slowly turned the light throughout the night. Everything was ready. With calm and practiced hands, he switched on the great beacon. A warm glow filled the lantern room. A few seconds later, the brilliant beam began its slow, graceful circle across the Atlantic Ocean. The lighthouse was awake once again. Far out at sea, a small fishing boat noticed the familiar light. The captain smiled. He had seen this lighthouse since he was a young boy sailing with his father. Its steady beam always made him feel close to home. Thomas watched the boat for a while before turning his eyes toward the endless horizon. The sea was calm, the wind was gentle, the night carried no signs of storms. It would be a peaceful evening for everyone on the water. He opened his weather journal and wrote a few simple lines. Date, July. Sky, clear. Wind, light from the northwest. Sea, calm. He closed the journal with a quiet smile. The pages were filled with thousands of ordinary evenings, yet each one was unique in its own gentle way. Outside, the moon slowly rose above the ocean. Its silver light danced across the waves, making the water sparkle like tiny stars. A cool breeze drifted through the open window. The lighthouse remained strong and silent on the rocky coast of Maine. Its beam continued to turn, slowly, steadily, faithfully, and high above the quiet Atlantic, beneath a sky filled with countless stars, Thomas whispered his favorite evening words. May every traveler find a safe way home. The lighthouse answered in the only way it knew, by shining its warm light into the peaceful night. Midnight arrived quietly along the coast of Maine. The lighthouse stood tall against the star-filled sky, its bright beam sweeping slowly across the calm Atlantic Ocean. Inside the lantern room, Thomas sat comfortably in his old wooden chair. A small oil lamp glowed on the table beside him. Its warm light filled the room with a gentle golden color. The great beacon turned steadily above him, round and round, never too fast, never too slow. Thomas listened carefully. He could hear the soft ticking of the lighthouse mechanism. Tick, tick. The sound had been part of his life for so many years that it felt like the heartbeat of the old tower. Outside, the sea was peaceful. Tiny waves rolled against the rocks below, each one making a quiet splash before slipping back into the ocean. The cool night breeze carried the fresh scent of salt water through the open window. Thomas wrapped a warm wool blanket around his shoulders. He poured another cup of chamomile tea and held the mug in both hands. The tea was warm and comforting. Far away on the horizon, a cargo ship moved slowly through the darkness. Its lights looked like tiny stars floating on the water. The captain could clearly see the lighthouse beam. Without a single word, the lighthouse showed the safest path along the rocky coast. Thomas smiled. He never met most of the people the lighthouse helped. Still, he was happy knowing they were safe. A shooting star crossed the sky for just a moment. It disappeared as quietly as it had arrived. Thomas watched the empty sky for a while, enjoying the peaceful silence that followed. Nothing disturbed the night. No loud sounds, No rushing footsteps, only the steady light, the endless ocean, and the gentle wind surrounded the lighthouse. The old clock on the wall softly chimed 1 o'clock. Thomas stood and walked once around the lantern room. He checked the great lens one more time. Everything was working perfectly. Satisfied, he looked out across the moonlit sea. The lighthouse continued its faithful work, sending its warm light into the darkness. And beneath the countless stars, Thomas felt grateful for another quiet night, another peaceful watch, and another chance to guide strangers safely home. The night slowly drifted toward its quietest hour. The lighthouse continued to shine with the same calm rhythm it had followed for generations. Thomas stood by the wide glass windows of the lantern room. The Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly beneath the moonlight. The water looked smooth and peaceful, like a blanket of silver. A gentle fog began to rise from the sea. It moved slowly across the water, wrapping the distant waves in a soft white veil. Thomas watched it with careful eyes. Fog was common along the coast of Maine. It made the lighthouse even more important. He reached for the old fog bell control. Soon a deep, gentle sound echoed across the quiet ocean. Dong. The sound traveled through the mist. After a short pause, it came again. Dong. The bell was never loud or frightening. It was slow, steady, and reassuring. Hidden beyond the fog, a small fishing boat answered with a soft horn. Thomas smiled. The sailors knew exactly where they were. The lighthouse was leading them safely toward open water. For the next hour, Thomas quietly watched the fog drift past the tower. The great beacon cut through the mist, sending its warm light into the darkness. Although the fog hid the shoreline, it could not hide the lighthouse. That steady light remained visible, faithful as ever. Inside, the old clock ticked softly. The oil lamp flickered gently on the wooden table. Everything felt warm and peaceful. Thomas opened one of his oldest journals. The pages had turned a soft shade of yellow with age. He found an entry written many years earlier. It described another quiet night, filled with gentle fog and calm seas. Thomas smiled as he realized how little had changed. The ocean still whispered to the shore. The lighthouse still guided ships, and he was still there, grateful for another peaceful watch. Outside, the fog slowly began to thin. One by one, the stars returned to the sky. The moon shone brightly once again. The lighthouse continued its endless circle of light, reminding every sailor that even on the darkest nights, a steady light could always lead the way home. A gentle breeze swept across the cliffs as the night slowly gave way to the first signs of morning. The sky in the east was no longer completely dark. A thin band of pale blue appeared above the horizon. Thomas noticed it and smiled. Another peaceful night was almost over. The lighthouse beacon continued its slow, steady rotation. Its light grew softer as the darkness began to fade. Far out on the Atlantic Ocean, the last few ships of the night sailed calmly toward distant ports. Their lights twinkled like tiny stars upon the water. Thomas watched them for a few quiet moments. He wished each captain and every sailor a safe journey. The lighthouse had done its work once again. Inside the lantern room, Thomas carefully cleaned the glass around the great Fresnel lens. Even though it was already spotless, he believed every morning deserved a fresh start. He wiped away the tiny drops of moisture left by the cool night air. The brass fittings shone warmly in the early light. Everything was ready for another evening. Outside, the first seagulls began to wake. Their gentle calls drifted through the fresh morning breeze. Below the cliffs, the waves continued their endless rhythm, rolling in and out without ever growing tired. Soon, the sun peaked above the horizon. Golden light spread across the sea. The water sparkled like thousands of tiny diamonds. Thomas switched off the great beacon. The lantern room became quiet. For a moment, there was only the sound of birds singing and waves meeting the shore. He slowly walked down the spiral staircase. Each familiar step reminded him of the many years he had spent caring for the lighthouse. At the bottom, he opened the heavy wooden door. Fresh morning air greeted him. The little orange cat was waiting outside, stretching lazily in the warm sunlight. Thomas laughed softly and gently stroked its head. Together they walked toward the small garden beside the lighthouse. The flowers were covered with sparkling drops of dew. Lavender filled the air with its sweet fragrance. Thomas picked up his watering can and began another peaceful morning, grateful for the simple joys of life. The lighthouse rested quietly behind him, waiting patiently for sunset, when its faithful light would once again shine across the waters of Maine. The morning unfolded slowly along the quiet coast of Maine. The lighthouse stood peacefully beneath a bright blue sky, while gentle waves rolled onto the rocky shore below. After watering the flowers, Thomas carried a small wooden bucket down a narrow path that led to the beach. The tide was low. Smooth gray stones glistened in the morning sunlight. Tiny shells rested between patches of soft green seaweed. Thomas walked carefully, enjoying the cool breeze on his face. He stopped beside a tide pool filled with clear seawater. Inside, tiny crabs moved slowly across the rocks. A small starfish rested quietly beneath the water. Thomas smiled. He had visited this tide pool for many years, and each visit felt like greeting old friends. Nearby, a family of ducks floated peacefully in a calm inlet. The mother duck led her ducklings across the gentle water. Each little duck followed in a neat line, leaving tiny ripples behind. Thomas stood still, so he would not disturb them. He simply watched. Nature always seemed happiest when it was left alone. As the sun climbed higher, the little orange cat appeared once again. It walked carefully across the rocks before sitting beside Thomas. Together, they looked out at the endless Atlantic Ocean. Neither of them made a sound. The quiet was comfortable. A soft breeze carried the distant scent of pine forests, mixed with the fresh smell of the sea. High above, a bald eagle glided gracefully through the sky. Its wide wings hardly moved as it floated on the warm air. Thomas followed it with his eyes until it disappeared beyond the cliffs. By midday, fluffy white clouds drifted lazily overhead. The lighthouse cast a long shadow across the grass. Thomas returned home and prepared a simple lunch of vegetable soup, warm bread, and fresh apples. He ate slowly at the small wooden table beside the kitchen window. Outside, the ocean continued its endless song. After lunch, he settled into his favorite rocking chair on the front porch. The chair creaked gently as it moved back and forth. The orange cat curled up beside his feet. The warm afternoon breeze, the distant sound of the waves, and the steady cry of seagulls blended into a peaceful melody. Thomas closed his eyes for a short nap. The lighthouse stood quietly behind him, keeping watch over the beautiful coast of Maine, waiting patiently for another calm evening to arrive. If you'd like, I can continue with part 14 in the same slow, relaxing bedtime style. Thomas awoke from his afternoon nap just as the old clock inside the lighthouse struck 3 gentle chimes. The orange cat stretched, blinked slowly, and jumped down from the porch. A soft breeze carried the scent of the sea through the warm afternoon air. Thomas smiled and stood up. The day was moving peacefully toward evening. He walked to the small woods behind the lighthouse. A narrow trail wound between tall pine and spruce trees. Sunlight filtered through the branches, creating dancing patterns on the forest floor. The only sounds were the gentle rustling of leaves and the cheerful songs of tiny birds. Thomas loved these quiet walks. They helped him notice the little wonders of nature. A red squirrel hurried up the trunk of a pine tree, carrying a small pine cone. It paused for a moment, looked at Thomas with curious eyes, and then disappeared among the branches. Nearby, a family of rabbits quietly nibbled on fresh grass in a sunny clearing. Thomas stood still, so they would not be frightened. The rabbits continued their peaceful afternoon as if they knew he meant no harm. After a short walk, Thomas reached a wooden bench overlooking the ocean. It was an old bench, weathered by many seasons of wind and rain. He sat down and watched the waves. The Atlantic Ocean stretched as far as he could see. The water sparkled beneath the afternoon sun. A sailboat drifted slowly across the horizon. Its white sail caught the breeze, and it seemed to glide without effort. Thomas took a deep breath. The fresh sea air filled his lungs. He closed his eyes for a moment and listened. The wind whispered through the pine trees. The waves rolled gently against the rocks. A distant gull called above the shoreline. Everything around him moved in a calm, gentle rhythm. As the sun slowly began to sink lower in the sky, golden light covered the cliffs and the lighthouse. Thomas knew that evening was not far away. Soon he would climb the familiar spiral staircase once again. Soon the great beacon would shine across the Atlantic Ocean, and as it had every night for many years, the lighthouse would quietly guide every traveler through the darkness, while Thomas watched over the sea with kindness, patience, and a peaceful heart. The golden afternoon slowly faded into evening. The sky became softer with every passing minute. Shades of orange, peach, and lavender spread across the horizon, reflecting beautifully on the calm Atlantic Ocean. Thomas returned from the forest path and stopped for a moment beside the lighthouse. He looked up at the tall white tower. Its windows glowed gently in the warm light of the setting sun. For nearly 40 years, this lighthouse had been his home. Every stone, every wooden step, and every window held a quiet memory. He gently placed his hand against the cool stone wall. "Another beautiful evening," he whispered with a smile. The little orange cat followed him to the front door, its tail held high. Thomas filled a small bowl with fresh water and gave the cat a gentle pat before stepping inside. The kitchen smelled faintly of fresh bread from the morning. Thomas prepared a light supper of warm vegetable stew, a slice of homemade bread, and a cup of herbal tea. He ate slowly, while watching the sun sink lower over the sea. Outside, the last fishing boats returned to the harbor. The water was so calm that each boat left a long, smooth trail behind it. A few seagulls circled overhead before settling quietly on the rocks. As twilight arrived, Thomas washed his dishes and carefully dried them with a soft cloth. He put on his familiar blue sweater and picked up the small brass key to the lantern room. The time had come once again. He opened the lighthouse door and began climbing the spiral staircase. Each step echoed gently inside the old tower. The sound was comforting. When he reached the top, he looked through the wide glass windows. The first stars were already shining above the coast of Maine. The evening breeze touched the tower softly. Thomas lit the great beacon. A warm light filled the lantern room before the powerful beam slowly began its steady circle across the darkening ocean. Far away, the captains of several ships noticed the familiar light. Without speaking a single word, the lighthouse welcomed them and showed them the safe path along the rocky coast. Thomas stood quietly beside the great lens. The waves whispered below. The stars sparkled above. The lighthouse turned faithfully through the peaceful night. And in that quiet corner of Maine, where the sea met the sky, Thomas felt grateful for another calm evening, another gentle sunset, and another night spent keeping the light shining for everyone who sailed across the endless Atlantic.